Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the picturesque, rolling landscapes of Virginia. The golden sunlight cascaded over the lush greenery, creating an almost serene atmosphere on the otherwise quiet Route 29. Officer Raymond Harper, a decorated yet controversial 20-year veteran of the state police, sat idly in his patrol car parked on the shoulder. Known among his peers for his meticulous attention to detail and his ironclad belief in upholding the law, Harper also carried a less flattering reputation. Over the years, murmurs of his predisposed actions toward minorities had surfaced, but none had stuck well enough to derail his career. With the radio softly humming static, Harper's piercing eyes scanned the sparse traffic with calculated precision. A sleek, black SUV caught his attention as it approached in the distance, its polished exterior glinting under the sunlight. Harper's radar gun beeped faintly. The vehicle was traveling just a few miles over the speed limit, hardly a significant infraction, but for Harper, it was enough. He placed his coffee down, flicked on his siren, and muttered under his breath, "Let's see who we've got here." The SUV obediently pulled to the side of the road, its driver showing no hesitation. Harper adjusted his hat and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel shoulder as he approached the vehicle. The driver's window rolled down smoothly. Behind the wheel was a man who appeared to be in his early 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit. His demeanor was calm, exuding an air of quiet confidence that seemed almost unshakable. Harper couldn't help but notice the man's polished appearance, but he didn't let it deter him from his usual protocol. "License and registration," Harper barked, his tone clipped and professional, yet carrying an undertone that was all too familiar. His imposing stance leaned slightly forward, an almost unconscious attempt to exert dominance. The man didn't flinch. He retrieved the requested documents with fluid precision, offering them to Harper with a polite nod. "Certainly, officer. Is there a particular concern?" His voice was smooth, laced with respect but devoid of fear. Harper glanced at the license and registration, his brow furrowing slightly as he read the name, Alexander Monroe. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but Harper couldn't immediately place it. The documents were in pristine order, as was the vehicle's registration. Nothing seemed amiss, yet Harper's instincts, or perhaps biases, prompted him to dig deeper. "Do you know why I stopped you?" Harper asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. Monroe met his gaze evenly. "I'm not entirely sure, officer, but I assume you'll tell me." The lack of nervousness in Monroe's tone unsettled Harper. He was accustomed to drivers fumbling with their words, their hands, or both. But Monroe remained composed, his expression one of polite curiosity rather than fear or deference. "You were speeding," Harper declared, his voice firm but lacking conviction. The radar had only shown a minor infraction, hardly worth pulling someone over, yet Harper felt compelled to justify the stop. "I see," Monroe replied, nodding once. "I wasn't aware, but if that's the case, I appreciate you bringing it to my attention." The response was disarming, devoid of hostility or challenge. Harper's frustration simmered beneath the surface. He felt his authority being subtly undermined, not by words, but by the man's unwavering composure. "Step out of the vehicle," Harper demanded, his tone sharper now. He couldn't quite articulate why he wanted Monroe out of the SUV, perhaps it was a hunch, or perhaps it was the nagging discomfort of confronting someone who didn't fit neatly into his preconceived notions. Monroe's eyebrows rose slightly, the first hint of surprise crossing his otherwise calm features. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Of course." As Monroe stepped out, Harper noted his height and bearing. The man carried himself with an almost regal grace, his tailored suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to the dusty roadside. Monroe stood tall, meeting Harper's gaze with a quiet strength that bordered on unsettling. "Is there a particular reason for this, officer?" Monroe asked, his tone still respectful, but now tinged with a hint of curiosity. Harper felt the question like a jab to his authority. "Just a routine check," he replied curtly. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood of your vehicle." Monroe complied without protest, his movements slow and deliberate. Harper began a perfunctory pat-down, his mind racing with questions he couldn't yet articulate. Who was this man? Why did he seem so familiar? And why did his calm demeanor feel like a challenge? As Harper moved to check Monroe's identification once more, a subtle shift in the air caught his attention. A black sedan pulled up behind the patrol car, and a sharply dressed man in sunglasses stepped out, his movements purposeful. "Officer Harper," the man called out, his voice steady yet commanding. Harper turned, his hand instinctively moving to his holster. The man approached, pulling out a badge and flashing it with practiced ease. "I'm Agent Willis with the Governor's Protective Detail," the man announced. "You're detaining Governor Monroe. Is there a problem here?" The words hit Harper like a freight train. He turned back to Monroe, his mind racing to connect the dots. Alexander Monroe, the recently elected governor of the state, a man who had made headlines for his transformative policies and efforts to bridge divides within the community. Harper's throat went dry. He had unknowingly stopped and detained the state's most powerful man. And worse, he had done so under circumstances that were already beginning to feel indefensible. Governor Monroe turned, his calm gaze now carrying a weight that Harper couldn't ignore. "Is everything in order, officer?" he asked, his tone still composed but now edged with an authority that left no room for misinterpretation. Harper opened his mouth to speak, but found no words. The routine traffic stop had turned into something far more significant, and the repercussions of his actions were only beginning to unfold. As the realization sank in, Harper couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would change not only his life but also the broader conversation about justice, equality, and accountability. What had started as a simple stop on a quiet afternoon was about to become a pivotal moment in his career, and perhaps the state's history. The tension in the air was palpable. Officer Harper stood frozen, the weight of his actions crashing down on him like a tidal wave. His hand, still clutching Governor Monroe's license, trembled ever so slightly. He had never imagined himself in a situation like this, and the reality of it was almost too much to process. Agent Willis, the sharp-suited man from the Governor's Protective Detail, stepped closer. His calm demeanor carried an underlying intensity, and his words were precise. "Officer, I trust there's a legitimate reason for this stop, considering the individual you've detained." Harper's mouth went dry as he struggled to piece together a coherent response. His mind replayed the events leading up to this moment, the radar blip, the decision to pull over the SUV, the smug satisfaction he'd felt when the driver rolled down the window. All of it seemed inconsequential now, a series of decisions driven by instincts he was beginning to question. I wasn't aware of his identity," Harper stammered, his voice betraying his nerves. "It was a routine traffic stop. The radar indicated the vehicle was speeding." Governor Monroe turned fully now, his expression calm but unreadable. He met Harper's eyes with a measured gaze, one that seemed to peer directly into the officer's soul. "And was there anything else that warranted this level of escalation?" he asked evenly. Harper swallowed hard, the subtle accusation in Monroe's tone cutting deeper than any outright condemnation. "No, sir," he admitted reluctantly. "There was no additional cause." For a moment, silence enveloped the roadside. The only sounds were the distant hum of passing cars and the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Harper's mind raced, his thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear, regret, and self-preservation. He had always prided himself on being a good officer, someone who upheld the law without bias or prejudice. Yet, as he stood there, he couldn't deny the uneasy truth simmering beneath the surface of his actions. "I see," Monroe said finally, his voice steady. He turned to Agent Willis and nodded. "Thank you for your diligence, but I believe I can handle this from here." Willis hesitated, clearly uneasy about leaving the governor in the hands of the very officer who had stopped him. "Sir, are you sure? We can escalate this if necessary." Monroe offered a faint smile, one that carried more authority than warmth. "That won't be necessary, Agent Willis. I'll join you shortly." With a reluctant nod, Willis stepped back toward his vehicle. Harper watched as the agent lingered for a moment, his sharp gaze fixed on the scene before him, before finally returning to the sedan and driving off. The departure of the protective detail left Harper and Monroe alone on the roadside, the gravity of the moment settling heavily between them. Harper cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. "Governor Monroe, I'd like to apologize for any inconvenience this stop may have caused. I assure you, my intention was never." Monroe held up a hand, cutting him off. "Officer Harper, let's not waste time on empty platitudes. What I'm more interested in is understanding the thought process that led you to this point. Why did you stop me?" Harper hesitated, the question catching him off guard. He had expected anger or indignation, but instead, Monroe's tone was one of genuine curiosity, almost as if he were conducting an interview. "As I said, sir, the radar indicated your vehicle was speeding. And that alone was enough to warrant having me step out of the vehicle and placing your hands on me?" Monroe pressed, his voice calm but unyielding. Harper's jaw tightened. He wanted to defend himself, to justify his actions, but he knew the truth would betray him. He had acted on impulse, fueled by a mix of routine authority and unconscious bias, and now he was being forced to confront it in a way he never had before. I followed protocol," Harper said finally, though even he didn't believe his own words. "Protocol," Monroe repeated, his tone thoughtful. "Tell me, officer, is it standard protocol to escalate a situation without clear cause? Or does that only apply in certain circumstances, when the driver fits a particular profile?" The words landed like a blow, and Harper felt his defenses crumbling. He wanted to argue, to push back against the implication, but he couldn't. Not when he knew, deep down, that Monroe was right. "I don't know," Harper admitted quietly. "I guess I wasn't thinking." Monroe nodded, his expression softening just slightly. "That's honest, at least. And honesty is a good place to start." Harper looked at him, unsure of what to say. He had spent years enforcing the law, operating within a system that often felt black and white. But now, confronted with the complexity of his own actions, he realized how much he had failed to consider, the nuances, the humanity, the larger implications of his decisions. "Governor Monroe," he began, his voice heavy with regret, "I don't know how to make this right. But I'm willing to listen." Monroe studied him for a moment, as if weighing his sincerity. "Listening is a start," he said finally. "But it's not enough on its own. Change requires more than words, it requires action, accountability, and a willingness to challenge the systems we've built and the biases we carry." Harper nodded, the weight of Monroe's words sinking in. He thought about his career, his reputation, and the countless stops he had made over the years. How many of them had been driven by assumptions he had never questioned? How many lives had he impacted without even realizing it? As the two men stood there on the roadside, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the asphalt, Harper felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. This moment, as uncomfortable and humbling as it was, held the potential to be a turning point, not just for him, but for the broader conversation about justice, equality, and accountability. "I want to do better," Harper said finally, his voice resolute. "Not just for myself, but for the community I'm supposed to serve." Monroe nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then start by examining your actions, your beliefs, and the role you play in the system. And remember, true change doesn't come from a single moment. It's a process, one that requires constant effort and introspection." Harper nodded again, his gaze steady. "I understand." Monroe offered a faint smile, one that carried a hint of hope. "I believe you do. And I hope you'll follow through." With that, he extended a hand. Harper hesitated for a moment before taking it, the gesture feeling both symbolic and deeply personal. As their hands clasped, Harper felt a sense of resolution, a promise, unspoken but understood. Monroe released his grip and stepped back toward his SUV. Harper watched as the governor climbed into the vehicle and started the engine. The sleek SUV pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the distance. Harper stood there for a long time, the events of the day replaying in his mind. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, a determination to be better, to do better, and to contribute to a future where moments like this would no longer be necessary. The setting sun dipped below the horizon, casting the road into twilight. And as Harper climbed back into his patrol car, he couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for him, but for everyone. The days following the encounter with Governor Monroe were a whirlwind for Officer Harper. His every thought was consumed by that moment on the roadside, the piercing gaze of the governor, the unspoken truths in their exchange, and the weight of the questions Monroe had posed. Harper had never considered himself a bad cop. He had always believed he was doing his job, following the rules, and enforcing the law without bias. But now, that belief felt like a fragile facade, cracking under the scrutiny of a single, transformative moment. Harper returned to work the next morning, stepping into the precinct with a heaviness he couldn't shake. The usual banter of his colleagues, the clinking of coffee cups, and the hum of the office all felt muted. His partner, Officer Daniels, a jovial man with a thick mustache and an easy laugh, noticed the shift immediately. "You good, Ray?" Daniels asked, leaning back in his chair and giving Harper a curious look. Harper hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, just, rough night." Daniels chuckled. "Rough night? You? Come on, man, you're like a robot. Nothing gets to you." Harper forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He wanted to confide in Daniels, to share the turmoil raging inside him, but he wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, he buried himself in paperwork, hoping the monotony would quiet his thoughts. But the world outside the precinct wasn't as forgiving. News of the roadside encounter had spread like wildfire. Social media platforms were abuzz with the story, though the details were sparse. Most posts celebrated Monroe's composure and the broader implications of his leadership, while others criticized Harper, accusing him of profiling and abusing his authority. Harper avoided reading the articles, but snippets of headlines and comments still found their way to him, each one chipping away at his already fragile sense of self. By the third day, Harper couldn't ignore the growing tension. Captain Hernandez called him into her office, her expression unreadable as she gestured for him to sit. "Ray," she began, folding her hands on the desk, "we need to talk about what happened with Governor Monroe." Harper's stomach tightened. He had anticipated this conversation, but it didn't make it any easier. "Yes, ma'am." Hernandez sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Look, I've reviewed the footage from your dashcam and bodycam. There's nothing overtly wrong with your actions, but the optics, they're not good. The governor handled himself well, but the situation could have escalated, and we both know how that would have played out." Harper nodded, his throat dry. "I understand, Captain." "Do you?" Hernandez asked, her tone softening. "Because this isn't just about you, Ray. It's about the department, the community, and the trust, or lack of trust, people have in us. You've been a good cop for a long time, but maybe it's time to reevaluate what that means." Her words struck a nerve. Harper had always taken pride in his work, but now he was forced to confront the possibility that his definition of good was flawed. "What do you suggest I do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Hernandez studied him for a moment before answering. The governor's office reached out. He's organizing a series of community forums on policing, justice, and equity. He wants officers to participate, to listen and engage with the people we serve. I think you should go. Harper's first instinct was to refuse. The idea of standing in front of a room full of people who likely hated him, explaining himself and his actions, felt unbearable. But then he thought of Monroe, of the quiet strength in his words, and the challenge he had issued. Change requires more than words. It requires action. "I'll do it," Harper said finally, surprising even himself. The first forum was scheduled for the following week at a community center in Charlottesville. The large hall was packed with people of all backgrounds, young and old, black and white, students and professionals, activists and skeptics. Harper arrived early, dressed in his uniform, his nerves fraying with every passing minute. He spotted Governor Monroe at the front of the room, speaking with a group of attendees. The governor's presence was magnetic, his calm authority drawing people in and putting them at ease. When Monroe saw Harper, he broke into a small, genuine smile and approached him. "Officer Harper," he said, extending a hand. "I'm glad you came." Harper shook his hand, the gesture feeling weightier than it should. "Thank you for the invitation, sir. I figured it was the least I could do." Monroe nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's more than that. Showing up is the first step toward understanding, and understanding is the foundation of progress." The forum began with a series of testimonials from community members, stories of encounters with law enforcement that ranged from positive to deeply troubling. Harper listened intently, his chest tightening with each account of fear, mistrust, and pain. One young woman described how her brother had been stopped and frisked multiple times for no reason other than the color of his skin. An older man recounted how a simple misunderstanding had escalated into a traumatic arrest. Each story was a reminder of the human cost of systemic flaws, and Harper felt the weight of his uniform like never before. When it was his turn to speak, Harper stood and faced the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on him. He cleared his throat, searching for the right words. "My name is Raymond Harper," he began, his voice steady but low. "I've been a police officer for over 20 years. In that time, I've seen a lot, good and bad. But I'm here today because I realize there's a lot I haven't seen, a lot I haven't understood. And for that, I'm sorry." The room remained quiet, the weight of his admission hanging in the air. Harper took a deep breath and continued. "I pulled over Governor Monroe last week because his vehicle was speeding. That's what I told myself, at least. But if I'm being honest, there was more to it than that. I acted on assumptions I didn't even know I had, and that's not okay. It's not okay for me, for the governor, or for anyone else." He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. Some looked skeptical, others curious, but a few nodded in quiet encouragement. "I'm not here to make excuses," Harper said. "I'm here to listen, to learn, and to figure out how I can do better, not just as a cop, but as a person." When he finished, the room erupted into applause. It wasn't unanimous, but it was enough to give Harper a glimmer of hope. As he sat down, Monroe leaned over and whispered, "That was brave. And necessary." Over the next few weeks, Harper attended every forum, engaging with the community and participating in discussions about reform. He began to see policing through a new lens, one that prioritized empathy, understanding, and accountability. He also started making changes within the department, advocating for bias training, community outreach programs, and policies that promoted transparency. The journey wasn't easy. Harper faced criticism from both sides, colleagues who accused him of betraying the force and community members who doubted his sincerity. But he stayed the course, driven by the memory of that pivotal moment on Route 29 and the promise he had made to himself and Monroe. Months later, Harper found himself back on the same stretch of road, the golden sunlight casting long shadows across the asphalt. This time, he wasn't scanning for speeders or looking for trouble. He was simply reflecting on how much had changed, within himself, within the department, and within the community. As he sat there, his radio crackled to life with a routine call. Harper responded, his voice steady and confident. He wasn't just a cop anymore. He was a bridge, a symbol of the change that was possible when people were willing to confront their own shortcomings and work towards something better. And in that moment, Harper knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The weeks turned into months, and the transformation within Officer Harper was both internal and external. He found himself looking at the world, and his role within it, differently. The forums had not only opened his eyes to the lived experiences of the community, but had also compelled him to face his own biases head-on. These realizations didn't come without resistance. Change, Harper had learned, was never linear or easy. The ripple effects of his encounter with Governor Monroe were far-reaching. Harper's colleagues were divided. Some appreciated his candor and willingness to address difficult truths, others saw him as a liability, someone who had betrayed the unwritten code of solidarity within the force. The tension was palpable during roll calls, shifts, and casual conversations in the precinct. Harper could feel the sideways glances, hear the hushed whispers. But he didn't let it deter him. One afternoon, as Harper was going through his daily reports, Captain Hernandez called him into her office. She looked more serious than usual, her sharp eyes narrowing as she gestured for him to sit. "I've been keeping an eye on you, Ray," she said, her tone unreadable. "I know you've been making waves, both inside and outside the department." Harper stiffened, unsure of where this was heading. "I'm just trying to do what I think is right, Captain." "And I respect that," Hernandez replied, leaning forward. "But you've stirred up a lot of feelings, and not all of them are positive. The department is under scrutiny because of what happened with Monroe. There's pressure coming from every direction, politicians, community leaders, even the media. And to be honest, some people upstairs think you're more trouble than you're worth." Harper felt his stomach drop. He had expected pushback, but the idea that his efforts might cost him his career was a bitter pill to swallow. "Are you saying I'm on the chopping block?" Hernandez sighed. "Not yet. But you need to be smart, Ray. Keep your head down, follow protocol, and don't give anyone a reason to come after you." Harper nodded, though the words felt hollow. Keeping his head down wasn't an option anymore. Not after everything he'd learned. As he left Hernandez's office, Harper couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He thought about the forums, the stories he'd heard, and the people who had trusted him enough to share their pain and frustrations. They deserved better. He couldn't back down now, no matter the personal cost. Later that week, Harper received an unexpected call from Governor Monroe's office. The governor wanted to meet with him privately. The invitation surprised Harper, but he agreed without hesitation. The meeting was scheduled at the governor's mansion, a grand yet surprisingly modest estate nestled in the heart of the city. When Harper arrived, he was greeted by Monroe himself, who led him to a quiet sitting room overlooking a lush garden. The governor's demeanor was as calm and measured as ever, but there was a warmth in his tone that put Harper at ease. "Officer Harper," Monroe began, offering him a seat. "Thank you for coming." "It's an honor, sir," Harper replied, feeling a mix of gratitude and nervousness. Monroe studied him for a moment before speaking. "I've been following your journey since our encounter. It hasn't been easy, has it?" Harper shook his head. "No, sir. But it's been necessary." Monroe nodded. "That's the right perspective. Change is always difficult, especially when it challenges deeply ingrained systems and beliefs. But I wanted to meet with you because I believe you have the potential to be a catalyst for something bigger." Harper frowned slightly, unsure of what Monroe meant. "I'm not sure I understand, Governor." Monroe leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I've been working on a statewide initiative to reform policing practices. It's called the Equity and Justice Program. The goal is to address systemic issues within law enforcement, from training and hiring practices to community engagement and accountability measures. And I want you to be a part of it." Harper's eyes widened. "Me?" "Yes, you," Monroe said firmly. "You've already taken the first step by acknowledging your own biases and working to understand the community you serve. That kind of self-awareness is rare, especially in your position. I need people like you, people who are willing to lead by example and advocate for change from within the system." Harper was stunned. The idea of being involved in something so impactful was both exhilarating and intimidating. "I don't know if I'm qualified for something like that," he admitted. Monroe smiled. "None of us start out qualified. We learn, we grow, and we rise to the occasion. The question is, are you willing to try?" Harper hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Yes, sir. I'm willing." Good, Monroe said, standing and extending a hand. Welcome to the team. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Harper became deeply involved in the Equity in Justice program, working alongside policymakers, community leaders, and fellow officers to draft proposals and implement pilot programs. The work was challenging, often frustrating, but it was also deeply fulfilling. Harper felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that his efforts could lead to tangible improvements in the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they served. One of the program's first initiatives was a series of workshops focused on implicit bias training. Harper was asked to help lead these sessions, sharing his personal journey as a way to encourage other officers to confront their own biases. Standing in front of a room full of his peers, Harper felt a mix of nerves and determination. "I'm not here to preach or point fingers," he began, his voice steady. "I'm here because I've been where you are. I've made mistakes, and I've had to face some hard truths about myself and the way I've done this job. But I've also learned that acknowledging those mistakes doesn't make you weak, it makes you stronger." The response was mixed. Some officers were receptive, eager to learn and grow. Others were resistant, dismissing the workshops as unnecessary or overly critical. Harper expected the resistance, but he didn't let it discourage him. He focused on the ones who were willing to listen, knowing that even small changes could have a ripple effect. As the months went on, Harper began to see the impact of his efforts. The forums continued, drawing larger crowds and fostering more open dialogue between the police and the community. New policies were implemented, including increased transparency in misconduct investigations and greater emphasis on de-escalation techniques during training. Harper's own precinct underwent a noticeable shift. Officers who had once been skeptical of his approach began to come around, recognizing the value of building trust and understanding with the community. The change wasn't universal, but it was a start. One evening, as Harper was wrapping up a long day at the precinct, he received a call from Governor Monroe. The governor's voice carried a note of quiet pride. "Ray, I wanted to thank you for everything you've done. The work we're doing is making a difference, and it wouldn't have been possible without your courage and commitment." Harper felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you, sir. But I'm just one part of this. It's a team effort." "Perhaps," Monroe said. "But every team needs someone willing to take the first step. And that was you." As Harper hung up the phone, he reflected on how far he had come since that fateful day on Route 29. The journey had been anything but easy, but it had been worth every moment of struggle and self-doubt. He had found a sense of purpose that went beyond enforcing the law. It was about creating a system that was fair, just, and compassionate. And for the first time in years, Harper felt truly proud of the badge he wore. The culmination of Officer Harper's journey came on a crisp autumn morning, almost a year after the pivotal traffic stop that had set everything into motion. The air was brisk, the sky a canvas of soft blues streaked with wisps of white clouds. Harper stood on the steps of the state capitol, his uniform freshly pressed, the badge on his chest gleaming in the sunlight. Around him, a crowd of hundreds had gathered, community members, activists, police officers, lawmakers, and journalists, all awaiting the launch of the governor's statewide Equity in Justice program. Harper scanned the sea of faces, feeling both nervous and honored. The transformation in his life had been profound, and he had spent the past months immersed in the challenging work of reform. He had spoken at dozens of forums, led countless workshops, and faced resistance and skepticism from all sides. But he had also seen change, real, tangible change, take root. And now, standing at the forefront of this movement, he felt a deep sense of purpose. Governor Monroe approached the podium, his presence commanding yet approachable. The crowd quieted as he began to speak. "Today marks a turning point for our state," Monroe said, his voice resonating with conviction. "We gather here not to celebrate what has been achieved, but to commit ourselves to what must still be done. Justice, fairness, and accountability are not static ideals, they are living principles that require constant care and vigilance." The governor's words carried the weight of the moment, but when he turned toward Harper, his tone softened. And none of this would be possible without the courage of individuals who are willing to confront uncomfortable truths, to challenge themselves and the systems they represent. Officer Raymond Harper is one such individual. He embodies what it means to be a public servant, not because he is perfect, but because he is willing to grow and learn. Officer Harper, would you join me? A wave of applause rippled through the crowd as Harper stepped forward, his heart pounding. Standing beside Monroe, he felt the enormity of the moment, the significance of his journey. When Monroe handed him the microphone, Harper took a deep breath, his thoughts racing. "Thank you, Governor," Harper began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "And thank you to everyone here today. It's an honor to stand before you, but it's also a reminder of how much work lies ahead." He paused, looking out at the crowd. "A year ago, I was a different man. I thought I was doing my job well, that I was serving my community the best way I knew how. But then I met Governor Monroe, and that encounter forced me to take a hard look at myself, at my actions, and at the role I played in a system that isn't always just or fair." Harper's gaze swept across the faces in the audience, many of whom were listening intently. "I won't pretend it was easy," he continued. "Acknowledging my own biases, my own mistakes, it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But it was also necessary. Because the truth is, we can't create change if we're not willing to change ourselves." He took another deep breath, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. "Over the past year, I've learned that being a good officer isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about building trust, showing compassion, and being accountable to the people we serve. It's about recognizing that every person we encounter is someone's parent, child, sibling, or friend, and treating them with the dignity and respect they deserve." The applause came again, louder this time, but Harper wasn't finished. "But this isn't about me," he said, his voice rising with conviction. "It's about all of us, officers, leaders, and community members, working together to create a system that reflects our shared values. That's why I'm here today. That's why we're all here today. Because we believe in a future where justice isn't just a word, it's a reality." As Harper handed the microphone back to Monroe, the crowd erupted into applause, the energy palpable. Monroe placed a hand on Harper's shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie and respect, before turning back to the audience. "Officer Harper's journey is a testament to the power of reflection, accountability, and action," Monroe said. "Let his story remind us that change is possible, but it starts with each of us." The remainder of the event was a blur for Harper. Speeches were made, initiatives were announced, and the crowd buzzed with excitement and hope. But for Harper, the real moment of clarity came later that afternoon, when he found himself sitting on the steps of the Capitol, watching as attendees slowly dispersed. A familiar voice broke his reverie. "Mind if I join you?" Harper looked up to see Governor Monroe standing beside him, a warm smile on his face. Harper gestured to the empty spot beside him, and Monroe sat down, the two men gazing out at the sprawling lawn in companionable silence. "You did well today," Monroe said after a moment. "Your words mattered." Harper nodded, his thoughts far away. "It still feels overwhelming," he admitted. "Knowing how much needs to change, how far we still have to go." Monroe nodded thoughtfully. "It is overwhelming. But that's why we take it one step at a time. One conversation, one policy, one person willing to stand up and say, 'We can do better.'" They sat in silence for a while longer, the sun dipping lower in the sky. Finally, Harper turned to Monroe. "Do you think it'll ever be enough? That we'll ever get it right?" Monroe's expression was contemplative. "I think perfection is an impossible goal," he said. "But progress? Progress is always within reach. And as long as there are people like you, people willing to try, to listen, and to lead, I have hope." Harper considered his words, a sense of quiet determination settling over him. He thought about the path that had brought him here, the lessons he had learned, and the lives he had touched. He thought about the young officers he was mentoring, the community members who had shared their stories, and the vision of justice that had begun to take shape. "I won't stop," Harper said finally, his voice firm. Not until we've done everything we can. Monroe smiled, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. I wouldn't expect anything less. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the Capitol in a warm golden glow, Harper felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead was long, and the challenges were immense. But for the first time, he knew he wasn't walking it alone. And that made all the difference.